In 1984, 12 children vanished during a routine field trip in rural Pennsylvania. No bodies, no witnesses, just a bus that never came back. For decades, the case haunted the town until a farmer uncovered rusted metal buried deep beneath his land. What they found wasn't just the missing bus. It was the beginning of a truth no one was ready to face. The morning of October 14, 1984, started like any other for the parents of Stonebridge Elementary School. Fall had painted the trees in crisp shades of amber and rust, the air sharp with early frost, as backpackers were zipped, lunchboxes packed, and sleepy children herded toward the familiar yellow school bus. It was field trip day, a visit to the Ridgeview Nature Reserve just under 40 miles outside of town. The kids had been buzzing about it all week. For most of them, this was their first time seeing deer tracks or roasting marshmallows by a ranger's fire pit. For the Donnelly family, it was especially meaningful. Sarah Donnelly had been looking forward to Lily's excited report all week. Lily, age 10, with a bright blue backpack and 2 match socks, was her youngest and most imaginative child. "Don't forget your jacket," Sarah had called out as Lily ran back for her favorite scarf. "And listen to Mr. Fenwick if you wander." Lily's laughter echoed across the lawn as she waved and bounded up the steps of the bus. That would be the last time Sarah saw her. The vehicle that took them, the one registered under license plate STX 409, was not driven by the usual school driver, Mrs. Halliday, who had called in sick that morning due to a sudden migraine. Instead, the substitute was a man named Dwight Rayner, a name few in the school administration recognized. Records showed he had been cleared by a third-party staffing agency, one contracted during bus shortages. A quick review of his file showed no prior offenses, no red flags. Still, to this day, Sarah wonders how such a forgettable name could become the one that reshaped 12 families' lives. By mid-morning, the school secretary received a call from the Ridgeview staff asking if the children were running late. That marked the first moment of concern. It wasn't uncommon for buses to be delayed, especially with winding back roads and a chilly fog that often blanketed the hills. But when the hour passed and no bus arrived, phones began to ring. The school, the police, the parents. Panic was slow at first, numb confusion, logistics. Maybe they'd taken the wrong turn. Maybe the driver got sick. No one wanted to say it. Not yet. Meanwhile, the last confirmed sighting of the bus was at 8:47 a.m., captured on a gas station security camera at the edge of Stonebridge's western exit. Grainy footage, later recovered, showed the bus at a red light, windows fogged, kids barely visible inside. Rayner's face was never clearly seen. The camera only captured his silhouette, cap low, eyes obscured. At the time, no one thought to check the feed. By the time investigators reviewed it 2 days later, the tape had been overwritten. In the hours following the realization that the bus had not arrived, police issued a BOLO alert. Officers drove the route multiple times. Helicopters from neighboring counties scanned the tree lines and riverbeds. Dive teams searched retention ponds. Volunteers combed through back rows with walkie-talkies and printed maps. But by nightfall, not a single sign of the bus or the 12 children inside had turned up. It was as if they had vanished into the Pennsylvania soil. The unease deepened into dread when dispatch logs revealed a strange report at 9:14 a.m. that morning, filed by a road maintenance worker on duty near Glenmere Fork. He claimed to see a school bus stopped on a gravel path that wasn't on the official route. Looked like it was just waiting there, no hazards on. I thought maybe it broke down. He hadn't stopped to investigate. By the time officers followed up the next day, rain had turned the gravel to sludge, and any tire tracks were long gone. And then there was the surveillance failure. Of the 8 traffic cameras that should have tracked the bus westbound, the last 2, at the most remote intersections, were blank. Not offline, just blank. No video data for a 4-hour window. That fact didn't come to light until weeks later, when a retired IT technician finally raised the question, who had deleted the footage and why? The children, 12 in total, 7 girls, 5 boys, were never heard from again that day. No emergency call, no radio dispatch from the bus, no sign of forced entry or roadside accident. Nothing. It was a mystery so stark, so brutally quiet, that even the national press struggled to cover it coherently. The tragedy clung to Stonebridge like morning frost, silent, biting, impossible to shake. Sarah Donnelly remembers that day as if it were frozen in place. "I knew something was wrong before lunch," she once said in an interview. "There was a ringing in my ears. I couldn't explain it. Mothers know. I kept calling the school, then Ridgeview, then back to the school again. They said they were working on it. My heart never stopped racing after that." In the days that followed, the town of Stonebridge transformed. Missing posters lined every lamppost. Candlelight vigils drew hundreds. News vans parked for weeks. The story dominated headlines. 12 children gone on Pennsylvania school trip. The vanishing bus. No leads. No closure. Rayner's photo, a DMV portrait with weary eyes and a tight-lipped smile, was plastered across every screen. But no one could find him. Dwight Rayner had no known address. No family who stepped forward. His last payroll check was never collected, and so the case turned cold. 2 days after the bus disappeared, a pale, feverish boy named Billy Ford sat cross-legged in his bedroom, wrapped in a fleece blanket, while 2 uniformed officers gently asked him to recount the last time he saw his classmates. Billy had stayed home sick the morning of the trip, a mild flu keeping him under his mother's cautious watch. He didn't go to school that day, but his mind had been stuck on something Lily Donnelly told him during recess the day before the trip. "She said something weird," he whispered to the hallway, eyes darting nervously toward the hallway. "Lily said, 'Tomorrow's going to be different. This trip doesn't feel like the others.' I thought she was just nervous or trying to be dramatic." His words were brushed aside at first, categorized under children's chatter, the kind of thing kids say without realizing its weight. But for Sarah Donnelly, that sentence would repeat in her head for decades. Why would Lily say that? What did she sense? In the initial chaos of the investigation, many such small details were overlooked. The police prioritized mapping routes, interviewing drivers, consulting forestry maps. Volunteers focused on physical search areas. No one had time to untangle cryptic words whispered on a school playground. But as days passed and leads thinned, it was the smallest things that began to haunt the families. Sarah remembered Lily had insisted on bringing her old scarf, even though it was frayed at the ends, and she'd recently outgrown it. It wasn't until later that Sarah realized the scarf had gone missing too, never found among Lily's other belongings. Another mother, Janice Caldwell, whose daughter Rebecca was among the 12, noted that Rebecca had asked an unusually specific question the night before. Janice hadn't thought twice about it. She'd laughed it off. Now she couldn't sleep without replaying the moment. Then came the lunchbox. It was a jogger who found it, a woman named Elaine Parker who ran early morning loops around the outskirts of Stonebridge. On October 18th, 4 days after the disappearances, she reported spotting a small pink and white container tucked under an old sycamore tree just off Miller's Trail, about 2 miles east of the school. The spot was overgrown and easy to miss unless one knew the path well. The lunchbox was scratched but intact. Inside, nothing had been touched. A sandwich wrapped in wax paper, a granola bar, a juice box still cool from the chilly weather. A name written in faded permanent marker read, Jenna. The lunchbox belonged to Jenna Reyes, age 9, one of the missing. Forensic checks revealed no fingerprints other than Jenna's. No blood, no dirt, no signs of distress. The box had not been dropped, it had been deliberately placed. There was no note, no trail leading away from the area. Police swept the zone, brought in dogs, and dug into the nearby soil. Nothing else turned up. The lunchbox was collected, logged, and eventually shelved in a storage unit marked Miss. Evidence, 1984. It remained there to this day, never explained, never followed up properly. Sarah, upon hearing about the discovery, felt something twist in her stomach. It was like someone was mocking us, she said later, like someone wanted to remind us they were always one step ahead. Back at the school, other children began to share small, unnerving details, though many were dismissed as the byproduct of fear and suggestion. One child mentioned a man they had never seen before standing near the back of the parking lot on the morning of the trip. He wore a dark jacket and leaned against a pickup truck, watching silently as kids boarded the bus. Another swore he saw Mr. Fenwick arguing with the substitute driver before departure, though the angle of his view made the faces hard to confirm. They were mad about something, the boy said. Mr. Fenwick was pointing at a clipboard. The driver just shook his head, yet the school's logbook stated that all permissions and instructions had been given clearly. Fenwick himself, missing along with the children, could not verify or deny the claim. Then there were the strange calls. On the afternoon of October 15th, several parents reported receiving blank phone calls from black numbers. No voice, no static, just silence, and then a click. A few assumed it was the press, others thought it was a cruel prank, but one father, Henry Wiles, claimed he heard faint breathing before the line went dead. "I know what I heard," he insisted, even when others told him it was stress or imagination. "I sat there, holding the phone, begging whoever it was to speak." It wasn't just dead air. Someone was there. The deeper the town tried to dig for answers, the more unsteady the ground beneath them became. Hearsay collided with hard fact, memory tangled with assumption, and through it all the same question loomed large. Why were details so fragmented, so off-kilter, as if the story had been carefully dismantled before anyone could piece it together? By the 1-week mark, the town's grief had turned inward. Parents stopped talking to each other, afraid of false hope or fresh pain. Authorities turned their focus toward procedural reviews, trying to determine where oversight had occurred, but no amount of auditing could explain away missing security footage, absent personnel records, or a lunchbox placed like an offering in the woods. Another crisis in another state, fresher headlines. The vanishing of the Stonebridge 12 began to blur into the collective fog of unsolved tragedies. But inside Sarah Donnelly's home, inside the home of every parent left behind, time fractured that day and never repaired. Sarah kept Lily's room untouched. Her bed was made each morning. Her books stayed stacked on the desk, the scarf folded neatly on the chair that Lily never came back to wear. Then, in early November, nearly 3 weeks after the disappearances, Billy Ford was interviewed again, this time not at home, but at the local sheriff's department, flanked by a child psychologist. His fever was gone, his thoughts were clearer, and that's when he said something else, something that hadn't come up in the first conversation. Lily didn't just say the trip felt different, he told them. She said she thought someone else had changed the route. She said she heard a phone call. Late. The night before. From someone she didn't know? The boy clutched his hands together as he spoke. She said she didn't want to go, but she had to. That's what scared her the most. The days after Billy's second interview blurred into a frenzy of renewed searches, escalating from routine patrols to full-scale rescue operations. With his new testimony suggesting that Lily might have overheard a suspicious phone call and expressed fear about the trip, law enforcement reopened every trail, and Sarah Donnelly's trembling voice on local news urged the community not to give up. The Stonebridge Police Department coordinated with the Pennsylvania State Search and Rescue Unit to expand their perimeter. Helicopters were redeployed, canine units brought in, forest rangers, volunteers, even local hunters joined in, fanning out across the wooded ridges west of the school. For a moment, it felt like momentum had returned, like the case was breathing again. But that illusion wouldn't last long. Within that chaos, a confession surfaced, quietly, unassumingly, but potent enough to alter the direction of the investigation, had anyone chosen to listen. It came from James Tully, a seasoned volunteer from Allegheny County Search and Rescue, who had worked search and recovery operations for more than 2 decades. In a conversation over coffee with another responder, a moment never intended for public ears, James admitted that during the second day of searches, his unit had followed faint but fresh tire impressions off the paved road into an area of dense undergrowth bordering Carson Ridge. The tracks didn't match any rescue vehicles, he said. They were wide, heavy-duty, like something a bus would make. They marked the position, radioed it in, and prepared to continue. But then, according to James, they received direct orders to leave the ridge and reassign to the suburban zone east of the school. We were told there was more likelihood the kids had wandered on foot, that it was a waste to dig around dirt paths. But I remember thinking, no kid walks into that forest willingly, not that deep. When pressed, James only added one more thing. It wasn't a request. It was a firm instruction, almost urgent. By the time this statement reached official channels, it had been watered down, passed through whispers, reduced to a footnote. Sarah, however, heard the unedited version. She called Tully herself, got his number from another mother. They spoke late into the night, and when she hung up, she cried harder than she had in weeks, not because it confirmed what she had feared most. Someone was steering the search away from where it mattered. Then came the postcard. On October 24th, 10 days after the children vanished, a small envelope arrived at the Donnelly home. No return address, no postmark beyond the state label, Montana. The paper was rough, industrial, like something bought at a gas station. Inside was a single blank postcard, yellowing at the edges, its front displaying a snow-covered mountain with a crude print of "Greetings from Red Antler, MT." There was no message, no greeting, no sympathy, no explanation. Just a name, scrawled in all capital letters with a shaky hand. L.D. Sarah stared at the card for nearly an hour. She turned it over, sniffed it, held it to the window light. The signature was unmistakable. L. Lilly. The sheriff's department took the card in for analysis. There were no prints, no DNA, nothing to trace. The town of Red Antler was a blip on the Montana state map, population 78, no public school, no cell towers. When the local authorities were contacted, they reported no unusual sightings, no newcomers matching Lilly's age, no buses seen in weeks. The lead dried up fast, yet Sarah couldn't let it go. She bought an old road atlas, circled Red Antler, and marked the direct driving route from Stonebridge. She stared at the line between the two, wondering how far a school bus could get before being noticed, wondering how many miles Lilly could have traveled before someone decided her name was too dangerous to say aloud. Other parents began to withdraw, not emotionally, but physically. The O'Malleys moved to Ohio. The Parkers stopped attending vigils. Mr. Fenwick's sister publicly questioned why no one had investigated his possible involvement more deeply. The police pushed back, citing lack of evidence, pointing fingers at the media for stoking rumors. But Sarah refused to be silenced. She photocopied the postcard and sent copies to every investigative journalist she could find. She drove to 3 other towns with similar terrain and asked gas station clerks if they had seen any buses. Most thought she was crazy. A few looked uneasy. One, in particular, leaned in and whispered, "People don't go to Red Antler by accident. If someone went there with kids, it wasn't because they got lost." Back in Stonebridge, a local pastor who'd led prayer circles for the children took Sarah aside after Sunday service. "I've had members tell me about lights out by the Carson Ridge trailhead late at night," he said. "Trucks, noises, maybe smugglers. I don't know. But if something's out there, it's buried deep." That same day, Sarah visited the town archive. She asked to see land ownership records for properties near the ridge. Most were forest lots owned by timber companies, but one parcel, about 300 acres wide, belonged to a man named Ernie Dwyer, an old farmer who died in 1983. Since his death, the land had been held in trust by an out-of-state company. Sarah asked for the trustee's name. The clerk didn't know, said it had been sealed. At home, Sarah placed the postcard in a plastic sleeve and taped it inside her closet door, at eye level. Each morning she stood before it, staring at the capital letters. Some days she saw them as a cry for help, other days a warning. But always she read them aloud, like a promise. Meanwhile, at the edge of Carson Ridge, long after the last poster had curled at the corners and peeled off the poster, something still waited under the leaves. Tire marks, barely visible, just out of reach of any well-worn trail. Sarah Donnelly spent most of the winter of 1984 with the taste of paper in her mouth. Old records, photocopies, requests, denial letters, a parade of legal jargon and closed-door silence that echoed louder than any scream. As months passed and no new leads surfaced, she shifted her focus from forests and trail maps to policy, to the thin, dry veins of bureaucracy, where so many answers go to die. She demanded access to police files, city records, school employment logs. Most were denied. Ongoing investigation, they said, but over time, that phrase lost weight, became a shell used to delay, defer, disappear. By the time 1992 arrived, the Stonebridge Police Department had a new captain, a lean man named Caleb Dunny, who preferred clean desks and orderly archives. In a routine administrative memo, he announced the department would be streamlining storage, relocating old case files to an off-site facility due to structural renovations and space limitations. The missing children's files, labeled Stonebridge 12 in red ink, were among the first boxes removed, but when Sarah filed a request under the Pennsylvania Public Records Act in 1994, she was told those files could not be located. No transfer slip existed, no signature documented the movement. The warehouse manager, a part-time employee nearing retirement, said he'd never received any boxes from Stonebridge that year. They might have sent them to the Central State Archive, he said, shrugging, or maybe to the DA's overflow unit. But when Sarah followed up, the DA's office had no record either. The paper trail had evaporated. She wasn't the only one who noticed. In 1995, a retired detective named Arthur Merriman contacted her, responding to one of the many classified ads she had placed in old editions of the Stonebridge Gazette. Merriman, who had served on the force until 1989, remembered the case well. "I was young then," he said, "but there were details we were told not to chase too hard. It was always strange. Nobody ever said it out loud, but it felt like something bigger was at play." Merriman brought with him a battered briefcase and a six-pack of beer. They sat in Sarah's kitchen as he unfolded copies of old internal memos, photocopied without permission before his departure. One memo, dated November 2, 1984, referred to outside jurisdictional concern and communication overlaps with federal offices. Another, even more cryptic, included a list of license plate numbers, many blacked out. Only one remained visible, STX 409. Sarah leaned in. "That's the bus," she whispered. Merriman nodded, then tapped the corner of the page. "See that code? 7FD Delta? That wasn't standard local ops. That's federal classification. I think someone else got involved, quietly, and then pulled out, leaving us to mop up the confusion." But when she asked who signed the memo, Merriman frowned. "That's the thing. The signature is missing, just the initials RP, and no one ever figured out who that was." Digging deeper, Sarah learned that Merriman had once been part of a covert task force that, in early 1984, began investigating a suspected underground network smuggling undocumented immigrants across state lines. The operation, codenamed Brass Shelter, was never made public, but internal reports hinted that the group used decommissioned school vehicles to move people discreetly across rural terrain. When Sarah asked if the bus could have been mistaken or repurposed as part of that network, Merriman hesitated. "It's not impossible," he admitted, "but if that were the case, someone had to make it disappear deliberately, and they had to do it fast." Another clue emerged when a former city clerk, Annette Reyes, contacted Sarah through a church newsletter. Annette claimed to have once filed a batch of city payroll records from 1984, and among them was a temporary hire listed as Rayner D., with a pay stub issued for just 2 weeks in October. The address on the form? A postbox in Maryland that no longer existed. Sarah tracked the lead, finding that the P.O. box had been registered under a shell company that dissolved months after the disappearance. Every thread she pulled led to another that frayed and fell apart. By 1996, Sarah had built her own archive. In the basement of her home, shelves lined with binders, folders, taped interviews, and timelines, none of it recognized by any official authority. She showed it to a young journalist named Maria Ellis, who was new to investigative reporting and looking for her first real story. Maria listened to the recordings, read the memos, and published a piece titled "The Town That Lost 12," sparking renewed interest in the case. For a few weeks, news vans returned. People came forward. One of them was a man named Willis Grant, a former park ranger who claimed to have seen the bus, or one like it, parked under a tarp behind an old lumber facility near the state line. But by the time anyone went to check, the structure had been demolished. The story once again slipped from headlines, but Sarah's determination hardened. Her questions grew sharper. Why had no one been held accountable for the missing files? Who had the authority to scrub an entire archive without oversight? Why had a low-personage case been entangled, even briefly, with a federal smuggling operation? Her obsession consumed her. Friends distanced themselves. Her husband, already emotionally frayed, moved out in 1998. "You're living with ghosts," he said, "and they're not letting you live." But Sarah couldn't stop. She felt it in her bones. Something had been buried, and not just the truth about her daughter. Someone had made sure those children were never found. Someone had cleaned up after it, and if they had erased files once, they could do it again. Late one night, while reviewing Merriman's old notes, Sarah spotted something she hadn't noticed before. Scribbled in pencil on the edge of a torn memo was a reference. DPW truck. Route diverted 10/14, talk to Mulroney. She didn't recognize the name. She didn't know what department DW referred to, but she copied it onto a sticky note and placed it next to the postcard on her closet door, another fragment in the puzzle. For years, Sarah Donnelly's sticky notes accumulated like dust, layered over each other in a quiet storm of dates, names, fragments of overheard conversations, scanned receipts, and now a scribbled mention of Mulroney, a name that led nowhere despite months of calls to every Department of Public Works in the region. Her life had taken on a rhythm of absence, no holidays, no photos updated, no birthdays celebrated, just the slow churn of time and the relentless flicker of what if. Still, the case remained publicly cold. Until, one afternoon in August 2019, a man named Frank Sievers, who owned 180 acres of farmland on the southern edge of the old Carson Ridge territory, paused his tractor mid-turn when he felt a strange jolt beneath the soil. He was tilling land for soybeans, something he'd done every year since inheriting the property from his uncle in 2002. But this year the equipment had struck something, metallic, thick, solid. He climbed down and dug by hand for a few minutes before his fingers brushed against the curved surface of rusted steel. It was large, buried deep, and shaped like a panel. He initially assumed it was an old fuel tank or possibly leftover debris from World War II. Local legend held that some fields had been used for military storage decades ago. He covered it again with soil and thought little of it, making a note to mention it to his cousin, who worked at the county office, next time they met. But he never did. 3 months later, Frank's niece, Caroline, a college student home for the holidays, overheard him telling the story at Thanksgiving dinner. She happened to be studying environmental archaeology and insisted on returning to the site with him. On December 1st, they returned with shovels, gloves, and a portable scanner borrowed from her university. What they uncovered was no fuel tank. It was the side panel of a school bus, still bearing faded yellow paint beneath layers of compacted earth, corrosion, and root growth. The partial outline of a number remained. She took a photo and sent it, without her uncle's knowledge, to a local journalist who had once written about the Stonebridge 12. The story published within a week. The effect was immediate. News vans arrived before the sheriff's department even had time to confirm the location. Drones buzzed overhead. Speculators and true crime bloggers descended on the area like vultures. But more importantly, the story reached someone who had been waiting for the right moment. On the morning of December 10th, the Stonebridge County Investigative Office received an anonymous email from a Proton mail address. It was short, cold, and chilling. "You're digging in the right place, but dig deeper. It's not just under the dirt, it's under everything. You've only scratched the edge." There was no sign-off, no IP trace, no further message. Sarah, now 67, still checked her inbox every night before bed, and when she saw the forwarded email, she sat in silence for several minutes, heart pounding like it had in 1984 when the school secretary first called. She forwarded the message to herself, printed a copy, and pinned it next to the postcard from Montana. The letters seemed to echo one another. The excavation effort began in earnest just before Christmas. Teams arrived with ground-penetrating radar, forensic experts, and structural engineers. The area around Carson Ridge had been overlooked for decades, mostly written off as too wide, too dense, too wild to comb through efficiently. The bus, it turned out, wasn't just buried. It had been intentionally driven into a narrow ravine and covered with earth, rock, and debris, then left to be swallowed by nature. The discovery ignited fresh tension in the community. Some officials welcomed the attention, others felt exposed. A local newspaper ran an editorial asking who ordered the search away in 1984, but no one answered. As crews unearthed the vehicle's frame, Sarah stood behind the yellow police tape every day, watching. Her hands never stopped moving, sometimes ringing, sometimes gripping the railing. She didn't sleep. She barely ate. "I'm not expecting to find her," she told one reporter. "I just want to know where she was." When they finally broke through the final layer and saw the cracked windows still smeared with ancient dirt and cobwebs, the forensic team fell into a hush. The air inside had collapsed decades ago. Seats were visible, some twisted by pressure. No bodies, no bones, just silence. On the back of one seat, someone had scratched letters, dozens of them, overlapping like a desperate script. They weren't legible yet, but specialists took digital impressions. Sarah wasn't allowed to see them, not yet, but what truly shook the team wasn't the inside. It was what they found just beyond the bus, hidden beneath a layer of sheet metal and plastic tarp. A shallow trench, rectangular, recently disturbed. The soil here was darker, looser. Something had been moved, possibly exhumed. Dogs were brought in. They barked, circled, paused. The lead investigator, a woman named Linda Morrow, ordered a 20-foot grid excavation around the perimeter. This wasn't just a dump site, she told Sarah off the record. Someone came back here. That night, back at the sheriff's department, the anonymous email was read aloud again during briefing. Dig deeper. What did that mean? Theories abounded. Some suggested another vehicle might be buried. Others thought the bus was a decoy meant to distract from a more crucial discovery nearby. A few feared it was all an elaborate hoax, someone playing on a tragedy. But one technician from the GPR team noted anomalies beneath the eastern slope, an unusual, consistent void roughly the size of a crosspace. Sarah didn't care for theories. She wanted action. She began driving the county roads again, visiting people she hadn't seen in years, asking questions no one liked. She returned to the park ranger's outpost, where Willis Grant once worked, hoping to find someone who remembered the tarp cover's office and demanded to know who had filed land surveys in 1984 for the Seavers farm. The new clerk, fresh out of grad school, simply blinked. "That information isn't digitized," she said. "It might be in the archived records." Sarah wrote down the name of every land transaction in the area for the past 40 years. Somewhere in that list, she believed, was the link. Meanwhile, another email arrived, this time sent directly to the Pennsylvania Bureau of Missing Persons. It was from the same anonymous account. One line. "She wasn't the only one watching. You missed the second." The excavation intensified after the second anonymous email arrived. The ground around the eastern slope was combed inch by inch, every shadow and vibration measured, mapped, recorded. Technicians grew quiet, more careful, less dismissive. The radar data pointed clearly. Beneath layers of earth and broken shale was an unnatural cavity, large and rigid. Within 48 hours, crews reached it. At 6.5 feet beneath the surface, they uncovered the complete frame of a school bus, nearly intact but deeply corroded. Its once yellow paint now a mottled patchwork of rust and moss. But what stunned the forensic team wasn't just the preservation of the vehicle. It was the lock. The front door, warped and tight from decades under pressure, was secured by a thick industrial-grade chain, wrapped through the handles and fastened with a rusted master padlock. The chain had been wound from the outside, not the inside. Someone had made sure that no one inside could get out. As news of this detail leaked, public outrage surged. Commentators speculated, politicians issued statements, and the Stonebridge community spiraled once again into media chaos. But for Sarah, the chain was more than evidence. It was betrayal. "They were trapped," she whispered, her hand pressed against the temporary fence surrounding the site. "Someone chained that door shut and walked away." Warheads neck teams in hazmat suits worked in shifts, documenting every inch of the bus's exterior before attempting to breach the door. It took over 5 hours with cutting tools before the padlock finally snapped. When the doors creaked open, the interior exhaled a hollow, acrid gust, stale air trapped since the fall of 1984. Everyone froze. Cameras clicked. Sarah stood at the edge, trembling. Then the investigators stepped inside. There were no bodies. No bones, no remains, just the ghost of movement, loose dirt on the floor, a broken lunchbox near the rear, a child's sneaker pressed into dried mud beneath one of the seats. The ceiling was collapsed in places, and water damage had darkened the metal ribs of the roof, but the seat cushions remained recognizable, some with faint initials carved into the foam. But it was what they found on the walls that no one could explain away. Faint scratches lined the aluminum siding, clustered in frantic arcs. Not made by tools, not animals. Fingernails, tiny repeated scratches like someone had been clawing from the inside. Near the rear emergency exit, too warped to open, forensic lights revealed a chilling smear, red, oxidized, ancient. A field test confirmed it. Human blood, and just above the window, in jagged letters, someone had written a message. "Don't forget us." Each letter was uneven, some barely legible. The streaks of blood were dry, fragmented by age, but unmistakable. The scene paralyzed the crew. The FBI was brought in that evening. Sarah was escorted away for her safety, but she didn't resist. She'd seen what she needed to. The image of those words would never leave her. Back at home, she sat in the kitchen and stared at the wall, the postcard from Montana still pinned beside the anonymous emails. Her daughter's initials. The scratched walls, the blood, the chain. They were alive, she said aloud to no one. For a time, they were alive inside that bus. That night, the forensic pathologist in charge of the site issued a preliminary statement. There were no visible remains, but the scratches, the message of biomedical indicators, suggested that multiple people had once been inside, alive, possibly for several days. Dehydration, starvation, panic. The evidence was circumstantial, but no one doubted what it pointed toward. The emergency hatch on the roof had been welded shut from the outside. The side windows reinforced with makeshift metal braces. Whoever buried the bus had not just wanted it hidden, they wanted it sealed. In the following days, old witnesses came out of hiding. A trucker named Gene Lasky stepped forward with a strange memory. Back in late October of 1984, he'd stopped at a diner near Carson Ridge and noticed a flatbed trailer carrying something large, covered by a brown tarp. It looked like a bus, he recalled, but it had no wheels, and the guy driving the rig seemed nervous. When he tried to report it back then, the local sheriff told him, "Unless you got a license plate, you didn't see anything?" More whispers followed. A retired municipal worker mentioned hearing rumors of a secret burial during foundation work near the Secrets property in 1985. Guys joked about finding a coffin of all holes, he said, but we thought it was just clacking from panic. "Look behind the third row on the left," instated Brian. Behind the third seat, they found a narrow seam, almost invisible. Inside it, tucked between insulation and metal, was a piece of cloth, blue with faded white stripes. Lily's scarp, her name tag still sewn in, the letters worn but intact. Sarah broke down when they handed it to her. She had nothing left to say. Meanwhile, as forensic teams continued to process the bus, questions mounted. Why no remains? Where were the bodies? If the children had died inside, why wasn't there evidence? And if they hadn't, who had taken them out, and when? Soil analysis revealed that the ground above the bus had been disturbed twice, once in 1984, then again sometime between 1997 and 2001. That meant someone had returned to the site, not to bury, to retrieve. But retrieve what? And then, buried in the far rear wheel well, forensic experts discovered something odd. A tiny button, navy blue, with a gold emblem engraved on its surface. The design matched the old uniforms used by the Stonebridge Elementary Student Council in 1984. A role Lily Donnelly had proudly won just 2 weeks before she vanished. The button had traces of skin oil, a partial print, and one long blonde hair wrapped in its threads. The forensic team continued working through the interior of the buried school bus, cataloging every inch with forensic scanners and ultraviolet light. It was during a secondary sweep of the rear seats that a technician found a small blood smear on the edge of the rusted frame. It had been missed during initial analysis. Dry, dark, barely distinguishable from oxidized grime, but under the scanner, the residue registered as a biological sample. The lab preserved it and submitted it to the National DNA Database, expecting nothing. After all, the sample was more than 3 decades old, but 72 hours later, the system returned a match. The DNA belonged to a man named Victor Reyes, convicted in 1991 in New Mexico for unlawful imprisonment of minors. The news hit like a hammer. Sarah could hardly breathe when she heard the name. Reyes had served time but had been released on parole in 2008 and disappeared shortly thereafter. His last known address was a trailer park near Albuquerque. Local law enforcement attempted to contact him, but the trail had gone cold. What shocked investigators wasn't just the match, it was the timeline. The DNA from the bus had likely been left in 1984. That meant Victor Reyes was either inside the bus during the time of the disappearance or had accessed it shortly afterward. Either way, he had never been questioned in the original investigation. He hadn't even lived in Pennsylvania. Or so everyone thought. Digging deeper into his background, investigators discovered Reyes had worked seasonal construction jobs in Pennsylvania and West Virginia, between 1982 and 1985. One project placed him just 30 miles from Stonebridge in September of 1984. The company he worked for, Durham Facilities and Roads, went bankrupt in 1986. Its employee records were incomplete, but a copy of an old payroll form placed Reyes near Carson Ridge the week before the children vanished. That was enough to launch a manhunt. The FBI reopened files on Reyes, classified him as a fugitive, and issued a warrant for questioning. But by the time agents arrived at his last known relative's home in Utah, the man had been gone for years. "He just left one night," said his cousin. "Didn't take anything, just walked out and never came back." His car was found abandoned outside a gas station in Nevada 2 years earlier. No fingerprints inside, no sign of foul play, just a torn photo in the glove box of a school bus. Meanwhile, another lead surfaced. A nurse practitioner named Helen Muncy contacted authorities after seeing news reports about the recovered vehicle. She had worked at a small clinic in Red Antler, Montana during the 1990s. In her email, she recounted a memory that had haunted her for years. "It was spring of 1997, she wrote. "A teenage girl came in with a man she called her uncle. She had a fractured wrist, said she fell during a hike. She was quiet, pale, and wouldn't make eye contact. Her chart listed her name as Rebecca S. Helen remembered it because the girl looked familiar. Something about her eyes. I thought I recognized her. I asked the man if they lived nearby and he got defensive. They left quickly after I signed the splint. At the time, Helen didn't connect it to anything. But after the recent media coverage, she found an old missing poster online. Becca Sullivan, same red hair, same dimples, same age, the timing lined up, but when local authorities were contacted back in 1997, there was no follow-up. No one came to Red Antler. No one investigated. When Sarah heard about Helen's report, she drove to Montana herself. She stood in front of the old clinic, now boarded up, and stared at the dusty windows. "She was here," she whispered. "Becca made it here." But where did she go next? The question ignited another round of media coverage. A national news segment ran the composite sketch of Victor Reyes alongside an age-to-grace photo of Becca Sullivan. Tips poured in, sightings, false leads, wild theories, but one in particular caught the FBI's attention. A woman from Idaho emailed a 1998 yearbook photo from a school in Salmon, Idaho. A girl in the background, blurry but visible, resembled the updated photo of Becca. The girl wasn't listed in the student roster. No name, no enrollment record, just a face that looked too much like the one that disappeared in 1984. Sarah printed the photo and placed it beside the postcard from Montana. The resemblance was uncanny. She reached out to a former teacher from that school year who vaguely remembered a girl who came mid-semester and left without notice. No transfer paperwork, no parents introduced. She just vanished, he said. One day she was in math class, the next, gone. The FBI followed the lead to an old RV park nearby. An elderly resident confirmed that in 1997, a man and a teenage girl had lived in Lot 17 for a few weeks. The man went by Victor. The girl called him That was all he knew. This discovery changed the tone of the case. Until now, most believed the children had died inside the bus. But if Becca had been seen, even once, 13 years later, then perhaps others had survived too. And perhaps someone had been moving them, hiding them. The idea was almost worse. Sarah spent sleepless nights wondering if her daughter had lived, only to be lost again, if she had grown up under a different name, in a different state, her memories fractured and buried. Back at the bus site, new evidence was being processed. Soil samples from the trench behind the vehicle showed traces of plastic fibers, consistent with tarp material used in the 1990s. One fragment matched a batch sold to a specific hardware store in Oregon. Purchase records listed a buyer, Victor Reyes. No family beyond the cousin in Utah, no clear motive, no connection to any of the children, so why them? Why that bus? And more pressingly, if Becca had escaped or been released, why didn't she come forward? Was she still alive? Was she still hiding? With Victor Reyes now the center of national attention and Becca Sullivan's 1997 appearance gaining traction among investigators, Sarah Donnelly turned her attention back to the land itself, the quiet field in Carson Ridge where the buried bus had spent decades hiding in plain sight. The more she thought about it, the more the site itself seemed deliberate. Not random wilderness, but a place someone knew intimately. She requested property records from the county, determined to trace every name listed as owner since 1984. The land had changed hands multiple times, mostly between shell companies, timber holdings, and a leasing firm in Maryland. But buried in a stack of handwritten documents from the mid-'80s was one name that stood out: Alan Wexler. The name meant nothing at first, just another transaction. But a few nights later, while revisiting old PTA newsletters from 1984 that she had saved in a dusty binder, Sarah found it again. Wexler had been listed as a substitute driver for Stonebridge Elementary's transportation unit. According to the school's October schedule, he had been on call the week of the field trip. He was never formally interviewed. His personnel record was thin, just a brief application form, a background check, and a list of substitute days. His final day on file was October 14, 1984, the day the children vanished. Sarah immediately alerted investigators. They ran his name through employment and property databases. Wexler had purchased the Carson Ridge parcel in 1985, 6 months after the disappearance under it, holding company named Crosslink Timber. He then sold the land in 1993 for a profit, vanishing from public records shortly thereafter. No one had noticed. No red flags, just another quiet transaction filed in a back office. A pattern was forming. People connected to the school, people who should have been questioned, had instead slipped into silence. But it didn't stop there. A local journalist named Maria Ellis, who had been working closely with Sarah since the rediscovery of the bus, began following up on public corruption rumors tied to Stonebridge's municipal offices during the late 80s and early 90s. She uncovered an audio cassette recording, anonymously mailed to her newsroom, labeled only "For Your Truth." The audio was grainy, the voices muffled, but clear enough to identify one of them as Richard Langley, a former city zoning official who had retired in 1995. In the recording, Langley's voice could be heard saying, "We were told to stay out of it. There was money. I'm not proud, but I took it. We all did. We were told, don't ask questions, don't dig." The other voice responded, "You mean the bus?" "The bus. They told us where not to look. Told us it was settled." When Ellis played the tape for Sarah, her hands began to shake. It was no longer a question of accident or oversight. Someone had orchestrated the erasure, redirected the search, bought silence, planted people in places of authority. It wasn't just Victor Reyes. It was bigger, organized, possibly still active by audio forensics and admitted into the reopened federal inquiry. Agents tracked Langley to a retirement home in Delaware. He was in the late stages of dementia and unable to testify, but family members confirmed that he had regretted something about the missing kids for years. One niece recounted that Langley would sometimes mutter in his sleep, "They were in the ground. Don't let them go deeper." The implication was terrifying. What did deeper mean? Sarah began compiling a new list. Names of everyone employed by the school district in 1984, cross-versed with land purchases, law enforcement jobs, and sudden resignations within 2 years of the incident. 4 names overlapped. 2 had died, 1 was in prison for unrelated fraud. The last, Howard Kimball, had moved to Florida in 1986. She called him. He hung up. Meanwhile, Ellis traced the Crosslink Timber Company to a law firm in Baltimore that specialized in asset shielding. When she posed as a potential buyer, she was told the firm had no current clients by that name, but a paralegal who overheard the call contacted Ellis later that night and revealed something chilling. Handled that account. It was closed in 2003, but the client had insisted everything be cash, no electronic trail, and he always asked if his name ever appeared on public forms. He was paranoid. When Ellis asked for a name, the paralegal said, "We knew him as Walt, but his real name was never listed." This information reached the FBI, who speculated that Walt could have been a co-conspirator or the orchestrator behind the bus burial. The pattern of concealment was too deliberate to be coincidence. The records, the land ownership, the substitutions in the school staffing, it had all been layered, hidden under bureaucracy and time. But there were still no children, no confirmed sightings, just traces, rumors, shadows. Sarah returned to the bus site every week, staring into the hole like it might speak. She noticed details others missed: like how the tree roots near the edge of the trench had been cut clean, not broken by machinery, but sawn. Someone had come back, and if they came back, they might have taken something away with them. She now believed Becca wasn't the only one who survived, but if the children had been hidden, who was protecting them? Or worse, who was keeping them? Even as more connections were uncovered between Alan Wexler, the land purchase, and the cryptic city officials who had kept silent for decades, Sarah Donnelly began to feel a shift, not just in the evidence, but in the very nature of the mystery. It was no longer just about what had happened in 1984, but what had happened since. Someone had visited the bus, someone had removed the children, and someone, perhaps more than one, might still be alive. Then, in early 2020, during a debriefing with a state cold case specialist, an officer casually referenced an unusual report from 2006 that hadn't been included in the federal database. Some woman walked into the precinct in Manchester, he said. Middle of the day, looked to be in her late 30s, maybe early 40s, said she had information about the Stonebridge kids, claimed she was one of them. Sarah's heart stopped. "What happened?" she asked. The officer frowned. She refused to give a name, said she'd only talked to a specific detective who had retired the year before. When told he wasn't available, she got visibly anxious, kept repeating, "They'll know. They're watching the doors." Then she just walked out, never came back. There had been no surveillance footage saved, no fingerprints taken. She hadn't committed a crime, so no report had been formally filed. Just a note in a desk drawer, now part of an informal record long forgotten. But what she said haunted Sarah. "I was one of them." She said it aloud that night while sitting alone in her kitchen. She was one of them. It wasn't proof. It wasn't even confirmation. But it meant someone had tried to speak. Someone had almost come forward. Why had she vanished again? Sarah began combing through press releases, travel blogs, and even amateur photo forums for unexplained sightings. She had learned long ago that truth often hid in the most mundane corners of the internet. That's where she found the Idaho photo. It was posted on an old message board in 2011, buried in a thread about long-distance bus travel in the Northwest. A man named Carter Hill had uploaded a series of images from a Greyhound terminal in Boise taken during a cross-country trip in 2010. The photos were grainy, mostly unremarkable, passengers in line, overhead signage, vending machines, but in one image, near the background, standing slightly apart from the others, was a young woman, pale, thin, late teens or early 20s, with long blonde hair and distinct cheekbones. She was staring at the camera, though Carter swore he hadn't noticed her when he took the shot. Sarah zoomed in on the face. Her fingers trembled. She knew that face, knew it like she knew her own. It was Lily, or someone who looked exactly like her, but aged, weathered, shaped by time. The photo had no timestamp, no metadata. Carter couldn't remember the exact day. It was early September, he guessed, maybe the 3rd or 4th. She was gone before we boarded. The FBI ran facial recognition. The software returned a 76% probability match with Lily Donnelly's childhood image, adjusted for aging, but without more data. It was inclusive. No other sightings, no credit card activity, no known aliases, just a single frame. A moment in transit, and then nothing. Sarah flew to Boise, retraced the steps in the photo, stood in the exact place where the girl had once been. She asked clerks, drivers, maintenance workers. No one remembered her, or if they did, they weren't saying. The terminal had changed hands since 2010. Records were sparse. She left flyers, talked to local news, begged for tips, but none came. The photo faded into rumor. Still, the idea couldn't be dismissed. If the woman in 2006 had been a survivor and the girl in 2010 had been Lily, then some of the children had not only escaped, they had adapted, hidden, perhaps even built new lives. But why had none of them contacted home? Why no letters, no calls, no confessions? Was it fear or something more insidious? As the investigation advanced, a behavioral profiler working with the FBI suggested a theory that the children had been systematically reprogrammed, isolated, controlled, maybe even convinced their families had abandoned them. It wasn't far-fetched. Cults had done worse with less time. You take a group of children, sever all ties, move them state to state, change their names, teach them fear, By adulthood, they're ghosts, the profiler said. And if they resurface, it's usually by accident. Sarah clung to that idea. It gave her hope, a cruel, fragile hope, that Lily hadn't forgotten, that Lily hadn't chosen silence, but had been taught it. Meanwhile, another postcard arrived, postmarked from Wyoming this time, blank again except for one handwritten phrase, "We remember the woods." No return address, no fingerprints, just the same shaky all-caps writing LD. The investigators ran comparisons. The ink matched the earlier card from Montana. The pressure of the strokes, the curvature of the L, the fragmented D. Identical. Sarah kept the card beside the first, side by side, like pages from a prayer book. Every night she stared at both and whispered, "I remember too." But she was no longer the only one. Other parents, now grandparents, had begun to see we're all gone. But maybe they're just waiting. By early 2021, the excavation site had become something between a memorial and a battleground. Families gathered weekly, holding candles and photographs, pleading for answers that still slipped between the lines of reports and statements. The forensic investigation had entered its final phase, with technicians combing the beach one last time before the vehicle would be transported to a secure federal facility for preservation. Sarah Donnelly, now quieter than ever, stood behind the yellow tape, arms crossed, eyes narrowed, waiting for something she could hold on to, some shred that would say her daughter had not simply vanished into myth. On the fourth morning of final analysis, while brushing debris from beneath the third row of seats, the same row where Lily used to sit, a junior technician paused. In the thick mat of compressed dust and decayed textile, she noticed a shimmer. It was no larger than a sunflower seed, pale, brittle at the edge, but perfectly intact. A fragment of a fingernail. Not unusual on its own, but this one still bore color, a streak of lavender purple, faded but unmistakable. The team froze. Sarah had mentioned it before. During the week of the trip, Lily had painted her nails with her older cousin using a bottle called Sugar Plum they'd snuck from a department store. It was the first time she'd worn polish. She had loved it, kept showing it off in photos taken just days before the disappearance. DNA analysis would take days, but everyone already knew. It was hers. After everything, here it was. Her proof. Sarah didn't cry. She didn't move. She simply closed her eyes and whispered her daughter's name. But the peace didn't last. That evening, as officials prepared to issue a press release confirming the discovery, something strange came to light. A tech specialist, tasked with cross-referencing drone footage and security logs from the dig site, flagged an anomaly. The motion seed surveillance system set up around Carson Ridge had gone completely dark for a 6-hour window, specifically between 11:32 p.m. and 5:47 a.m., the night before the excavation team broke ground on the trench that revealed the bus's full body. The interruption wasn't due to weather, power outage, or equipment malfunction. It had been disabled manually. No alert had been triggered, no password reset requested. It was as if someone had known the system's structure intimately and had walked past it, unseen. When local law enforcement reviewed the footage leading up to the blackout, they found a car parked just outside the perimeter, lights off, engine running. It had arrived at 11:18 p.m., stayed for 13 minutes, then vanished. The plates were obscured, no ID, no trace. Panic set in quietly. Who had been there? What had they done? Why had the cameras been shut off right before the world rediscovered what had been buried? Theories erupted. Some said it was someone tied to Reyes, returning to retrieve something or ensure nothing remained. Others believed it was someone from within the investigation, silencing a final piece of evidence. And others, like Sarah, feared something darker, that someone had been watching from the beginning, following every move, every press conference, each procedure, and adjusting course, just in time to keep the real story from being told. The FBI issued a private memo, unconfirmed interference at excavation, source unknown, intent unclear. Site now considered compromised. Security was doubled. The bus was relocated under escort, but the silence lingered. Sarah returned to the field one last time, alone. She walked the path from the fence to the spot where the third row had been unearthed. She stood over the shallow impression left by the excavation, letting the wind move through her sweater, eyes locked on the horizon. "You were here," she whispered, "and maybe you still are." Her voice cracked. "I didn't forget you. I never forgot you." She placed the old photograph of Lily on the ground and tucked a note beneath it. Then she turned, walked back to her car, and didn't look back. That week, another anonymous envelope arrived at the Federal Bureau. Inside was a single photograph, grainy, cropped, dated July 2019. It showed the same woman from the Idaho bus terminal walking beside a man, tall, thin, balding. His face turned from the camera, but in his left hand was a keychain. The shape dangling from it was unmistakable. A tiny silver school bus with the number 409 etched into its side. Note, no fingerprints, just one final question burned into everyone's mind. How many others were still out there? If this story left you speechless or gave you chills, don't forget to like and subscribe. There's more coming. I'd love to know, which part shook you the most, and where in the world are you watching from? Drop a comment below and let's talk about it.